What do you think is the future of education?
Oh, for sure. So, I mean, in brief, I would say that our entire education system needs to go through faster cycles of learning,
Faster cycles.
of learning.
Just unpack
Right?
that a little bit.
Yeah, right from the curriculum. Things are starting to change in the world at such a rapid pace. Curriculum needs to be updated at that pace in order to be teaching things that are relevant, right? Because earlier, maybe we stuck to the same curriculum for 10 years, okay, and then decided to have an overhaul. But a few months ago, there was no chat GPT, and today it's a different world.
Welcome to Will Talks, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I have an incredible speaker, somebody I really look forward to talking every time I get the opportunity because he leads so much insights. He shares so many insights every time I speak to him. His name is Jonathan Mendonca. And Jonathan, thank you for being here. And he's a co founder and director of strategy for Barefoot Edu Foundation. He's done a master's in international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School, and he's been awarded the New World Social Innovation Fellowship by the Harvard Kennedy College. He's a Young India Fellow, a Mother Teresa Fellow, and he's also a civil engineer. He's done his engineering from the VJTI, a prestigious institute in Mumbai. Jonathan, I am so glad that we've finally been able to make it for this podcast because we've been really like trying to get in touch with you and trying to set this up. So thank you so much for coming in.
Oh no, the pleasure is all mine.
What do you one of the things that come to mind when I call you or when I talk to you is about this amazing amount of insights that you have. You've been able to share these insights with me so clearly and so wonderfully, and most of these insights are very systemic in nature. I think you've done some work with education in large scale. Is that something that you'd like to shed some light about, throw some context for our listeners in today?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, when I started my journey in education around 7 years ago, I could have never, ever imagined that we'd be working at the scale of states, right? Like in UP, for instance, we work with 130,000 schools. And back then, I remember my co founders and I had done this little exercise where we thought, okay, what is scale for us? Right. And we all happened to write down on a sheet of paper and showed each other the sheet of paper, and it said 20 schools. Right. So when you just start out and you're running student workshops and teacher training programs, all trying to get an idea of what's going on in the education space, scale means something very, very different, right? Your understanding of how things operate also change. But we knew that we had no formal background in education, right? We weren't formal teachers. We hadn't studied a master's. So we also knew that we had to be sensitive. And I think that was something that we embodied when we set up Barefoot EDU, right? We chose the name Barefoot because when you walk barefoot, you're more sensitive to the ground that you trample on. And that's the level to which we wanted to embody sensitivity into our work, right? So that was one aspect. And the second said, okay, we're going to be sensitive, but how do we learn in the process of being sensitive, right? And we made a list of all the very interesting people we know. And we said, hey, let's just try to reach out to them. At max, they'll say no. And if they do give us time of day, we'll learn something for them, right? There's also so much to read and so much to learn from. They could at least help navigate that. And once you navigate that, then you have access to quality information, right? But most often, people always said yes. And in no time, we were talking to like people who are considered the biggies in the space, and they helped shortcut so many mistakes that we would have made if we just went in with even, a little more larger ounce of ego.
This is just so amazing because the way you just talk and the way you just bring out these complex adventures, is just beautiful because you simplify it. Does that framework and structure probably comes from your civil engineering background where you start looking at what makes something sturdy or what brings integrity to a system? Do you see any connections or any learnings that you've had from that, especially when it comes to education and large scale change in education?
So a lot of people ask me when they find out that I'm a civil engineer, they ask, why did you leave civil engineering, or what made you leave civil engineering? And I keep insisting that that never happened, right? And you never leave an engineering subject that you like because it forms your way of thinking at an abstract level. But also, think about it. The most expensive part of a school is the building that is constructed, right? You spend so much of time and monetary resources on this to create a classroom that children can't wait to get out of. Right. So that was the first insight of where learning should happen. If you're going to build a space housing something, right, it has to house learning, it has to embody learning at the same time. It cannot be this device within which learning happens, right? It has to be designed for learning. So we started to think about things at that level, right? If you stagger the height of two swings, you get a pendulum experiment because both swings have a different time period. And suddenly you have a live physics lab which children are studying gravity by being the bob of a pendulum rather than reading about it in the textbook, right? And similarly with waste pipes, we used to bury the pipes in the playground and have them emerge at different points so that if a child spoke into one pipe, the sound traveled and it came out at another. We had shades with primary colors, so when the sun would hit it at an angle, those shades would overlap and you would see the mixing of colors happen in front of you, right? So my journey in education started off by seeing how civil engineering, okay, could be so much more than what it's packaged or made out to be, right? And that was one of my learnings, that a generalist isn't someone who is good at everything, but who specializes to such a deep extent that you see how your specialization is applicable to every field.
Wow, that's profound. And I also want to share this, that I think this is where empathy comes in, right? Because when someone comes and commissions a civil engineer or an architect and say, "School banao, make a school for me," you can just stick to the standard rules, make it for 20 by 20, make it a C shape or an L shape, get maximum this thing, follow the NBC, like the National Building Code, and really like just hope that everything just falls through. But the way you say that, you start thinking about what are kids actually going to do in that classroom, what are kids, what kind of journey they're working on, and then is there something that you could do infrastructurally to help aid that or accelerate that learning? That itself, to me, is a demonstration of deep empathy and deep connection and deep context with the people that you're working for. So much of the world today are talking about empathy as the first step towards design thinking, empathy as the first step towards making change happen, or empathy or connection as the first step of making any solution. Of course, 10 or 15 years ago, people were talking customer behavior or consumer behavior. Uh, is that the same thing? Is it old wine in new bottle? Or do you feel that empathy and connecting with a customer is genuinely a very different aspect, especially in the social and developmental sector like education?
So there are two aspects to this. One is my opinion and one is fact of the matter, right? And I don't think that now organizations have the luxury of not being empathetic. And I call it a luxury because it's been like guised as this, right? Put in as little thought to create a standardized product that can meet certain sales standards. But now you can't sell if the client or if the student doesn't vibe with your product, right? And you can see how a lot of unicorns crash. You can see how a lot of companies are becoming obsolete just because they haven't moved with the time and tried to understand their consumer better, right? So one of the big questions that were faced in school is they say children have a shorter attention span nowadays than they had a while ago because of the short videos, reels, and all of this. So as an educator, do you cater to the shortening attention span and make it even shorter? Or do you help children overcome a short attention span and build in them a resilient skill to pay attention to a long conversation or a webinar, right? And these questions are often really difficult to answer. And most of the time, it's not one answer, it's a spectrum. And we can see how a lot of definitions are being dissolved into spectrums nowadays, right? From gender to energy and to a lot of other aspects. But by defining something as a spectrum, it tells you that you can provide learning experience A, B, C, and D. And the only way you can differentiate between what those learning experiences need to be is by empathizing with the children in your school, with the teachers who are going to be delivering that curriculum or teaching those lessons, with the parents who have a certain desire for their child to be educated in the first place. Because now, in this world where things are so easily available, they say a currency is grabbing attention, right? And how do you grab attention if you don't understand what someone's going to be attentive to?
Wow. That just to me suddenly says that we don't need to be just working or designing towards a limitation that a student has, which is attention, for example, but we probably just need to help overcome the obstacle of that limitation. And that is when teachers truly become change makers, right? That is when teachers truly become formative, or teaching becomes formative, where a child enters the school and through that experience becomes a different person or develops different competencies.
Mhm.
That to me, like, I mean, at least to me, that sounds like what teaching and development is about, right? And and keeping this in mind, would you like to share some insights about what you've seen works with teacher training, teacher development? Do Are you seeing teachers looking at their work as a job or a career, or are they looking at it as more? And if a principal listening to our conversation, if that principal wants to effect change in his or her school first, right? What do you think that that person should be aware of?
So most of my work thus far has been with principals and not as much with teachers, but I guess the basic principles stay the same, right? Takes me back to one of the first projects that we worked on at large scale. It was a district-wide intervention in Haryana, and we were working with the Anganwadi workers over there, and we realized after a little time that contrary to what people say about them, people have all sorts of nasty things to say about Anganwadi workers. But we found Anganwadi workers who were paying out of their own pocket to keep the center open, who were giving food to the children, right? Who were mentoring a whole bunch of other children, taking after school classes at no extra cost. And this is not what an employee does, right? If you treat someone like an employee, you say, okay, what's your role and responsibility? Are you meeting that? When you look at someone as a person who's doing this because even though they have other options, they find some kind of calling to the space, or maybe they're in the situation, but they can see deeper about what they need to do than what you have prescribed in your JD. Okay, when you see that, you start trusting them, and we started calling them mini NGOs
Oh,
instead of calling them government employees or government functionaries, as some people say. But the moment we did that, we could see a change in attitude in the way we interacted with them. We were no longer prescriptive. We were trying to genuinely understand, okay, what's going on. We were no longer taking things for granted. For example, if learning aids were not being used in the classroom, we were not assuming that they did not know how to use those, but we would probe into why aren't they being used. And it turned out in one instance, someone had been yelled at because learning aids were broken in their Anganwadi, and this was done very publicly. So as a result, the other Anganwadi workers got scared that their learning aids may break, and so they put it in the cupboard.
oh,
So the solution to this need not have been training, right? And we didn't have to undertake a training, but rather we had to issue to them a notice saying it's okay if learning aids break. It's not okay if learning aids go missing, right? And missing is where the line gets drawn from the government. And that just diffused the tension, and suddenly learning aids came into the hands of the children, right? Step two was figuring out the people who use this just by virtue of our population. There's a concept called positive deviance, where enough of people try something by mistake or intentionally, they will figure out a great solution. Just in terms of
unpack that a little bit more.
Okay, just in terms of sheer numbers. So there's an example of a place where I forgot the name, but one of these large scale nonprofits ran an intervention to combat malnourishment. And they gave everything that they could think was necessary to the families, including a pot in which to cook stew, the ingredients of the stew, the recipe of the stew. And in some families, nutrition improved, and in some, it didn't. And then they were baffled as to what could be going wrong now because everything's been given to them. So they started to make observations in people's houses. And they found that everyone was making the soup, everyone was giving the stew to the children. But in some families, okay, they were serving the children first by skimming from the top of the soup bowl because the soup was hot.
What? Yeah.
And in other families, they were digging the ladle all the way to the bottom and pulling out the carrots and the fish and the other nutritious substances. Now, in all households, the child was served first. In all households, the intention was good. But just by sheer number, some people deviated in such a manner that they got a positive result, right? And this exists in our population, right? When you have such large numbers, someone or the other figures out something, whether it's intentional or whether it's unintentional. And the art becomes in finding that and making sure that everyone else can see it so that they can learn from their peers. And if this happened on its own, it meant it's completely made for that context, right? You don't need any external capacity building. You don't need anything outside, right? It's born from there and it's shared from there and it's absorbed from there, right? So we took this concept, which we realized with Anganwadi workers, and we started applying it to teachers and principals. And that's when Barefoot launched an incubator for school principals, Renuma. And why we call it an incubator is because when organizations are incubated in these business incubators, they're trusted. No one tells you what to do, but rather people build your capacity to run a robust organization. And that's what we needed to do with principals. So we needed to acknowledge that they are the custodians of best practices. They have much more context of running their school than we do, but we have more context of running an organization than they do, right? And there were certain elements like securing funding for a school or stabilizing teacher attrition that had profound implications on the school, right? So those were things that we had to solve for. It was almost like becoming an expert at not being an expert, right? Figuring out what their expertise is,
Yeah.
and being an expert at pulling that out, surfacing it, making sure that they build a great organization around their intervention, and making sure that others get the platform to listen to this story from them.
It's incredible. This from that example that you shared, so many things just fired in my brain. Like one of the things that fired was, it's not enough to just design a great program, but you have to constantly monitor the program for impact and for deviance, right? Another thing is we got to refrain from judging too quickly. Is this working? Is this not working? Because there could be something that that's going to give us incredible amount of information. All this kind of all this points to the fact that we need to be a little more data conscious. I think a little bit of what's happening, why is it happening, why is it not happening here, and things like that. So, do you think these are some of the new skills or the new competencies that were perhaps earlier restricted to I don't know, behaviorists or researchers? Do you think now more of us working inside schools, even if you're not, even if you're just on the implementation side of an initiative, that we need to be aware and conscious of? And what are your thoughts around that? And does that then play with data science and understanding trends and what makes something work? What do you think?
For sure. I think if we're working for others, especially for children, we have an obligation to make sure that we are treading sensitively and that we're making impact, right? So the only way to do that is to collect data. But by data, I don't mean something extremely complex or something that researchers need to do. It can be really, really simple, right? And on one front, it can be when children are leaving a classroom to fill out an exit ticket, which is a simple check for understanding. And just by making a pile of the number of kids who got that question correct and incorrect, you have data visualized in front of you as to only a portion of my class understood, or a chunk of my class understood, or no one knows what on earth just happened in that lecture, right? There are other ways where, teacher, they say that if a student is called on to answer a question, all the children in his or her vicinity also start paying attention because they don't know whether they might be called on. So it's not as important to ask every child in the class a question, but to make sure that every zone of a class receives a question. And one really simple way for teachers to do that is to just, make a quadrant on a piece of paper. And every time they ask a question and get a response, just put a dot in that quadrant. And again, you have visual data. So a lot of data gets collected by everyone, right? But the question is, are you visualizing it, or are you interpreting it, or are you acting on it? Because only then collection of the data makes sense, right?
So this then kind of brings me to think that what are those environmental factors that go into into ensuring the data is collected, analyzed, and it is then informing initiatives that you do in a school. For example, um, sharing of information. They say
Yeah.
data is a new currency, or sharing information is how you build trust within an organization. So, what do you think about school systems? How are they sharing information? Are they creating a safe environment for their teachers to try, to fail, maybe, and and then to try again? That is another aspect of safety. Is there a safety net? And the third thing is, how do we have you experienced um, this default thinking today that some of us have, maybe many of us have, is there an app for it? Is there an app for it? So when you talk about words like data tracking, I'm immediately thinking of some form or a SQL server or a website. The minute you say data visualization, I'm immediately thinking of some kind of fancy graph making, visualizing sort of software. And I start remembering 4 ads I saw on YouTube, and I say, oh, maybe I have to actually do a course before I end up doing data visualization. But you so beautifully laid it down to say that that's tracking data. That's what visualization looks like. And then do we hit a block where if the organization doesn't believe in sharing or transparency or discussions, then maybe there's no point in collecting that information. So what have you seen working well for schools and organizations and large scale systems where people have been able to use whatever data they have to be able to make massive change happen?
So those are a lot of questions, but taking them one by one. So like I briefly spoke about how easy it can be to collect and visualize data, right? The second aspect to that becomes what data are we collecting, right? What is important data, and are we just collecting data because it's the cool thing to do, or is it meaningful? Because there is no point to collecting data if you're not going to use it,
Mhm.
right? So now it got to be what's usable information. Now, in the context of the principles, right? Let's say I am linking um, the training of principles, the capacity building of principles to student outcomes. And my student outcomes is their performance on math, English, and science, for instance, right? Now, take the case of a principal who, through our program, has figured out how to be a little more thoughtful about simple things that they're doing, like they're building a toilet in the school, but they're going to elevate the toilet a little bit so that as effective drainage and the toilet doesn't get clogged with water all the time, right? Suddenly you have an increase of girl children attending that school. You have a higher retention of teachers taking place over there. And it may not directly translate into student outcomes in the way that we are measuring it right now. But if we ask a kid whether they're happier in school than they were last month, that's some form of data that's meaningful to us, that helps us track things forward, right?
Mhm.
Another would be if you truly are building the capacity of people, right? What is that truthful indicator? Are they just implementing what you told them? Because that is some form of success, right? But is it meaningful to you? And in our case, we were saying if we're going to build capacity, what does that mean? It means someone needs to think beyond us, right?
Mhm.
And we introduced a metric to say, can a principle surprise us? Much like the Turing's test, where you ask, can AI surprise me, right? And we say, if that's an expectation we have out of AI, we definitely need to have that out of humans, right?
Mhm.
But can a principle surprise us? Which means we talk about all these interventions, but is there an intervention that is initiated by them
Mhm.
that is not what we've spoken about? Then it means that they're thinking on their own. And
They're
that's a true
generating.
metric of success, right?
Yeah.
So, kind of like what Bhutan has done for GDP with its gross national happiness,
Mhm.
we need to do that for educational outcomes as well. And say, yes, definitely continue to measure outcomes in math, science, English, and the whole suite, but also introduce certain metrics of child well-being and capacity to think for oneself, to problem solve, things like that. A third aspect becomes there is no debate that the current metrics that we used for child success in standardized exams is strongly linked to income.
Really?
Yeah, this has been proven in a ton of different countries. A lot of research papers talk
More money,
about it.
better results
Yeah,
in standardized tests.
you come from a more affluent background, it's more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely that you will perform better on a standardized test. So now once we know that, like, isn't it about time, instead of building support metrics for kids to fare well on on a test that is proven to serve a certain community, can we not change the assessment metrics to some extent, right? Things like problem solving. It's not like anyone who comes from a low income family has less problems to solve. Collaboration, right? Some of the poorest communities don't rely on newspapers for information sharing, but are completely abreast of everything that is happening in their village, right? So there are certain metrics that are not linked to income, which definitely also need to be introduced into the education system, right? So I thought it was important to talk a little bit about what we're measuring before we get into is it worth sharing, right? Because if it's not meaningful, then it's like keep it as a stack at the side.
It just becomes meaningless activity, right?
Yeah. And now to answer your question when it comes to sharing, okay, this is a personal opinion, but I feel that the moment you share information, you're forced to operate at the top of your game, right? Because you can't rely on your past laurels. You can't be repeating that same information. People look to you for the next bit of information that you're going to share. And I think honestly, so much of time and effort goes into discovering and creating information. The least we can do is share it.
Mm.
Right. So a lot of our work, especially that which focuses on decentralization, talks about creating permanent platforms where principals, teachers, students get to share their learnings with each other, because doing is just not enough when you're operating at the scale of India.
Wow. So there are two big things here. One, what do you mean by decentralization? Like when you say decentralization is a big word, unpack that. Principal, teacher, or student looking at our podcast, what do you mean by decentralization in education or schooling? And the next question is going to be scale. Like I know the whole of Dubai has I think just under 175 schools.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know the whole of the UK has just under 27,000 schools. And you're working with 138,000 schools in just one state in India. Of course, it's the biggest state. But maybe touch upon these two ideas in any way you deem fit.
Sure. So one thing we really got to understand when we think about scale is that scaling the product or the service is just one of the aspects of scale, right? You need to build your capacity to visualize scale. You need to build an organization to support scale, right? The structure that supports scale changes, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. Okay. And finally, you really need to build your support system that'll help you scale, right? Because if you're not getting sleep, you're not getting time to exercise and things like that when you're working with 10 schools, it's not like you're going to have more time when you start working with 1,000, right? So you need to get those resilient systems in place right from the beginning, okay, unrelentingly. So that as you scale, those resilient systems also scale with you, right? And those are the things that act as your totem or keep you grounded or in check, right? So that's one aspect, thinking about there are many things that enable scale before getting to scaling your product or service. And now when it comes to scaling the latter, right, they say at every scale, the nature of the organism changes completely. So things don't scale linearly. Like you can work with 4 schools or 5 schools by sending one program officer to that 5 schools. Now you work with 5 more schools. You're working with 10 and you send 2 program officers, right? Now you're working with 20 schools and you have 4 program officers and you need someone to manage those 4 program officers. So do you keep scaling like this, or do you say now at one point I've reached critical mass, I need to now facilitate knowledge sharing. Someone else other than me needs to be pushing the system, right? Who from the community is going to take lead to do something like this? But the nature of your intervention needs to start changing, right? They say, and it's a very popular adage, but they say an elephant is not many mice. It's a completely different organism, right? So similarly, when we started Renuma, we knew that the crux of this principal incubator is the coach. Because that coach helps translate all workshops, which may come across to a principal as random or relevant, into something of immediate practical relevance that they can deploy in their school, right? So that works fine when we're working with 20 principals or 100. But when you work with one district and you throw in like 10,000 schools, right? How are you going to get those many people to coach? It cannot be you. It has to be a government functionary, or it has to be part of something else, right? So the nature of who becomes the coach changes. So at some point, when you hit a critical mass, you stop thinking about scaling a solution, but you start thinking a lot more, like one of my mentors, Sanjay Purohit, says, you have to start thinking about the ability to solve a problem and how to scale that ability to solve a problem.
Mm.
So then you don't want to scale coaches by hiring coaches. You want to create a system where people can become coaches anywhere, anytime, any organization, any NGO that has a presence in a school should be able to send their staff for a training and suddenly become a support system to a principal. Right. And then you're not scaling your incubator, you're scaling the ability to support a principal.
That's brilliant. This kind of reminds me of what the British Prime Minister was talking about a couple of months ago. He was talking about big society, and he was talking about, in some way, good society, where he started throwing the idea that if the government is not able to help society, if the government is not able to, because in the UK, education and healthcare is free for its citizens, and if the government is not able to help, then he actually believed that society in general would come up and help people in need, and that's how they would help each other, and that's how they literally get through the winter or so. In that sense, if you have to look at India, do you think good society in this case would be parents of children? Because children are in school, and there are so many interventions and initiatives and NGOs working to change the way schools operate, or so that there is impact on the student. What do you think parents think about this? What do you think they? What is their view? Do parents actually feel that they're already getting the best possible education for their kids, or from your experience, do you feel that parents also feel that something is wrong?
Oh, I think there's definitely an increasing demand for better student outcomes, and that's been voiced at a lot of different avenues. There's also pressure on every government of every country to step up the education system, no matter at what level it is, right? Recently, our Ministry of Human Resources got changed to the Ministry of Education, which shows the government's focus on education and they're recognizing the need.
Wait a minute, just unpack that a little bit. Did we just get a Ministry of Education that we did not have in 60, 70 years?
It's specifically called Ministry of Education right now, which definitely reorients your focus on building people capacity to specifically focusing on education.
So what was it before we had a Ministry of Education?
Ministry of Home Affairs. Ministry of Human Resources, right? Or the HRD ministry. Right? And where employment, education, everything was put into one bucket. And that's fair. It's not like we weren't thinking about education earlier, right? Priorities change as a country goes through different evolutionary cycles. But I could say that across the world, there's an increasing demand for better student outcomes. There's an increasing demand for focus on 21st century skills, or at least what's being called 21st century skills. I personally believe we had those skills at the time when we were cave people, but
that's what got us here.
Yeah. To hunt prey that was larger than ourselves, we had to collaborate, right? To be strategic against animals that had claws and teeth that were much stronger than us, right? We had to find ways of communicating without shouting out across the forest, right? So we had more subtle and nuanced ways of doing things, and I think the emphasis on that is resurfacing. So I think it is relevant, and I think it's really fair for parents to ask that. But to add to your really good question about do you think civil society will step up? And I think it already has. So India is one of the few countries where the number of private schools is nearly 50% that of public, occupies nearly 50% of the total school-going population as public schools.
Wow. So while the schools may be much lower than the public schools, but the number of children studying it is much higher.
Okay, let me rephrase that. I fumble on that quite a bit. But the total school-going population in India is roughly 240 to 270 million children.
That's how many crores?
If you were to contextualize that into a country, just the school-going children in India would make up the 5th largest country in the world.
Wow.
And now half of that population...
That's the democratic dividend that people talking about, right? Okay.
People power.
People power. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So 50% of these school-going kids go to private schools. And when you think of a private school, don't think of a fancy private school like in...
Yeah, I'm thinking of an air-conditioned, massive 7-story building with
roughly 90% of these private schools, okay, charge a significantly lower fee than one would imagine. They charge under 25,000 rupees per year. And a majority of those, in fact, charge even less than that. Now,
Hang on for a second. Are you saying that more than half, a majority of these schools charge less than maybe 2,000 rupees a month? A majority of these schools charge less than 2,000 rupees a month.
yeah, in this
And they could
range,
still be like an ICSE or a CBSE school
or a state board school.
or a state board school.
Yeah. The schools that we hear of
Yeah.
and term as fancy schools are a very minuscule population of the total schooling system in the country.
Yet it gets so much mind share and everyone's talking about it.
Yeah. But to think about this, right? Why
That's not India.
would someone set up a low fee private school? There are easier ways to earn money. You run a school and you know that it can be a massive strain on
Yes. Resources.
massive strain, right? There are easier ways to do it, but they see it as a market opportunity because the number of schools that currently exist did not service the school going population, right? So where there was market failure, right, these private schools popped up, and they popped up. Not all of them, or rather, not even most of them are chasing money and things like that, but genuinely are single schools, not a chain, run by a person who has deep ties to the community and really wants to make sure that education helps the community transcend the difficulties that they went through. And this at a very large scale is civil society stepping up, right? It's branded as private schools and, looked away, but I think people are recognizing the importance of it nowadays, and really, really grateful that, a majority of children may not have gone to school did these not exist.
Wow. So that's civil society in action, right?
Yeah.
Probably the Prime Minister just spoke about what he saw in India.
Yeah. And if you, wind back to our parents' times, textbooks were black and white.
Yes.
There was a time when there weren't textbooks, right? So it's all advocacy that slowly built up to say that no, children deserve textbooks so that they don't have to copy what's written on the board but can read at their own leisure. And then someone says, no, a child should enjoy the color in a textbook. So let's make textbooks colored. And then someone said, but the textbook needs to want to be read. So how do we increase the thickness of a page? So there are rules as to how thick a page of a textbook needs to be and things like that into place.
Wow.
There was a time EVS was not part of our curriculum.
Oh, yes. I think maybe just 30 years ago it came into the curriculum, or maybe less.
And all of these are incremental progresses
that have been. Gloria in Mumbai who came up with EVS as a subject.
Okay. That's interesting. Like one of the Ashoka fellows also advocated for it and things like that. But we've made leaps and bounds of progress because people took action. And people stood up and advocated and dedicated their lives just to making a change as small as putting color into a textbook. Right?
That was brilliant. So with all this experience and with large scale systems, small schools, working with principals individually, working with teachers, working with large groups of teachers and school leaders, what do you think is the future of education like? Everyone seems to be having a theory or an opinion about what the future of education is. Many people are talking about AI, artificial intelligence, completely, waltzing into education. They're talking about AI being one of the biggest drivers of change in education. I think I read a report yesterday which talks about the present market. I think is $400 odd million, and it'll probably become some 100 billion or $200 billion in India itself. What do you think is the future of education?
Oh, so there's just so much, but like if I have to shorten it into a phrase,
and by future, maybe you could think about 10 years, 5, 10, 15, 20, I don't know, something like that, something which is a little more, not very far sighted.
Oh, for sure. So, I mean, in brief, I would say that our entire education system needs to go through faster cycles of learning.
Faster cycles
of learning.
Just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, right from the curriculum. Things are starting to change in the world at such a rapid pace. Curriculum needs to be updated at that pace in order to be teaching things that are relevant, right? Because earlier, maybe we stuck to the same curriculum for 10 years, okay, and then decided to have an overhaul. But a few months ago there was no chat GPT, and today it's a different world, and there's no saying what's going to happen sooner, right? So do you wait another 10 years to tell children that this is there, because they would have interacted with it already, right?
Mm.
So we need to ask ourselves, how do we get children exposed to the highest form of current debate,
Mm.
right? And the current education that becomes relevant to them. So the curriculum revamping needs to speed up to a tremendous level, number one, right? Second, when we think of schools, I think it comes back to the question that you had on empathy, right? And we need to see who our customers or our clients are. And they're not just children, they're children and parents,
Mm.
right? And the changing demands of parents also affect the schooling system. So if parents want to take up jobs that enable them to travel more,
Mm.
then maybe one needs to start thinking of school as a membership rather than a fixed school that you be attached to. Definitely, people need to start thinking of schools as hybrids, right? For so many reasons. One, why be restricted to the physical space that you have, right? You can run 2 cycles, it'll be more profitable for a school. You have access to education for more children in the same infrastructure, just with the people changing shifts, right? Or getting an additional shift over there. So I think hybrid education is just not escapable at this point. The third becomes assessment systems, right? The check for skilling and mastery. The way that we can see a ton of different colleges are finding it difficult to retain students right now, because students are getting jobs without getting a degree if they have the skill set, or if they get a certificate course from someone who's credible, right? Like Google certification or Facebook certification, things like that. So if that's happening at a college level, we really need to figure out how to equip children at a school level with certain skills so that they have the option, right, to navigate the society that lies ahead of them, irrespective of what happens to colleges.
Mm.
The next becomes the influx of technology into schools, where, it's very different in the generation you and I grew up in, because technology or digital screens came about after we were born.
Yeah.
But now children are born into this,
Mm.
right? So just like you have a sensory board for a child, and you have sand and you have bitumen and you have something soft and woolen, you also need to have a screen,
Mm.
because that is going to be something a child interacts with really often, right? Now, there's a lot of debate about how much to expose children to, blah, blah. And definitely everything that I'm saying comes with regulation, comes with like thought behind it. Okay. But technology is inescapable. In fact, they say that we already, okay, are, cyborgs to a certain extent, because people say your phone is an extension of your neocortex. It serves as an abode of memory for you. I miss meetings if it's not calendarized, right?
Mm.
So my calendar functions as a form of my neocortex currently. So when we're looking at things that way, we got to see how can technology be incorporated into educational systems to promote learning. And that means examining the way in which it's deployed, right? To say more on this is, let's say current assessment systems tell students, here's an essay topic, go home and write it, right? Or here's an essay topic, you have the next 2 hours to write it. And the students ask ChatGPT about it and get it in there, right? We need to change our assessment system to create some opportunities for students to think on their own. Some to say, okay, ask GPT, let that be your base, and print out the response that GPT gave you and how you have built up on top of that, right?
Mm.
A third instance could be ask GPT multiple different prompts, okay, and decipher what information is relevant and important, and construct your own paper by referring to different prompts. So it's not about getting tech to do your work or to skip certain cycles, but to say, instead of starting from zero, you can, by trying to do everything yourself, it's starting at a slightly higher level, right? It's the same thing as thinking about, would you embark on any task with this rule imposed on yourself that I cannot use a search engine like Google or Bing?
Mm.
So are we thinking at this stage of imposing that rule, rather than thinking, how can this tool be imbibed in our education system, and how can we find workaround ways to make sure that it contributes to a higher quality of education?
Yeah, my mom, by the way, has about 60 years of educational experience. She's been a teacher and educator for more than 60 years. And one particular point that you raised today, if she hears that, she will tell me, don't listen to that Jonathan guy, because he's saying don't go to college and don't get a big degree.
Just to be clear, that's not at all what
That's
I'm
not what you're
saying.
saying.
Yeah.
That's not what you're saying. That's not what you're saying. But you're saying there are other ways of getting jobs. Um, could you share a little bit about this? Because um, go to school, get high marks, then go to junior college, get high marks, then write a entrance exam, get high marks, and then graduate, do a graduation, 3 year or 4 year graduation, get high marks, and then do a postgraduate degree, get high marks, and then crack the entrance exams in a job, and get the lowest pay, and start,
Yeah.
and then prove yourself, right? uh, that looks like a lot of get high marks before you get the lowest salary of your life,
Yeah.
right? And it also looks like 7, 8 or 9 years. Um, so back in South India, everybody would do that, right? How is the world changing today in terms of looking at talent? How is the world changing today in terms of hiring people? And knowing what we now know about how these hiring behaviors are changing, what are the things that we need to keep in mind? And just for the record, I know you're not saying don't go to college. We're just talking about the future of work and how that could impact one's own decisions. Because I also know that student loans are a big problem. I personally know somebody in our office who's going to be taking a 70 or an 80 lakh rupee loan just to get a 1 year degree from the US, with literally no guarantee, of a job, or even a long visa for that matter. Any thoughts around that?
Oh yeah. So there's a concept in policy making known as Chesterton's fence, where it's a story. Basically, this fellow looks at a fence and says, "I don't know why this fence is there. Let's knock it down." And they say the wise policymaker would say, "If you don't know why that fence is there, I certainly cannot let you knock it down. Right? Go find out why it was erected in the first place, and once you know that, you have my consent to do whatever you want." Right? And I think before we start talking or dissing about college in any way, we need to think about why these institutions were set up in the first place and what have they become. And maybe those two aren't the same, right? But it's important to understand that, right? And over the years, college has been this place for learning to take place in a structured manner, and also for you to get a certain kind of stamp which acts as a filtration process, right? Where someone says, okay, if you passed engineering college, I can take for granted that you know basic math, you know these kind of things, you know X, Y, Z. But over the years, companies have started to increase their training budget on freshers because they're only treating that college as a initial filter, but not as enough relevance for someone to start working. Right? So you got to finish college and then you have to go through an internal training program before you start work, right? So I see this on LinkedIn all the time where students say they expect me to have work experience upon graduating, right? And how can you do that? Because I was in college. And I think the answer to that is internships, get experience. No one's stopping you from doing that, right? College has now become this bare minimum thing rather than do college and you're set, right? If you get into college, that's great. Okay. But also visit the library, also seek out internships, also like speak to people, get out there, because like looking back, we had a lot of free time when we were in college, right? So how can you make better use of that time become something super important? The second is that it's not that degrees or master's programs don't have value. They add tremendous value, right? But everything has a cost to it, right? A time and a financial aspect. And you pointed out that you know someone who's taking a loan. I heard someone the other day saying when I asked them, so like, what do you plan on doing? They said, I'll do engineering and then I'll think about what I want to do. Right. So has engineering become this thing to tick off the list before you start doing what you want to do or pursue your passion, or are there better ways to do it? Right. So even in Ivy League colleges and the best of the best, they're debating this. Does it make sense for someone to pay in excess of $50,000 to do a master's? That's 1 to 2 years. If there's a possibility of you completely changing your profession in 5 years, right? If you're going to stick to that profession, the answer, it would be a lot easier to say yes, right? But if you don't know, just like, I think I'm interested in the education space right now, but I don't know if I'll be interested in climate change or just the development sector and I want to experiment, then maybe it's a little expensive to experiment with that for most people, right? And taking this into consideration, taking this feedback, colleges have started to offer micro certification courses, right? So that you can get a micro certification in a specific field and you can take that and start working. And once you get more clarity, make a call, right? In fact, there's a book written by a couple of Harvard professors called the 60-year curriculum, which talks about how learning has now stopped being these epochs of degrees, but has become this lifelong process. And you got to assemble it like you would a Subway sandwich or anything like that, right?
Mm.
Say, this is my education experience. College is part of
This
it.
is my
These
stack.
internships are part of it. Speaking to interesting people are part of it. Yeah, but this is my stack. And this is what I'm going to take with me to the job market.
I love this idea because I think it's so difficult to explain to people about what lifelong learning means. At least I personally have had quite a lot of trouble explaining to parents or students or teachers or school leaders about what is the meaning of lifelong learning. To many, they just felt like lifelong learning is just curiosity. Or just be curious, a lot of incidental learning. Also, they look at it as lifelong learning. हाँ, जिंदगी भर तो हम सीखते रहेंगे. We'll keep learning, as we go through life and life experience. But I think the way you brought in focus and sharpness to this idea of lifelong learning, because you got to be a lifelong learner and a serious learner for two reasons. One, college is not enough, right? Because employers are looking for more than just college gave, what college given you. Second, college is also looking at you as somebody who needs to get that first job, right? And then college is like, you got to then go charter the courses for yourself, right? And you got to make your own path. But the other important aspect in all this is the fact that today people may have 6, 7, or 8 different careers in a 50 or a 40-year professional life. Then how are you going to become successful in all those 5, 6 different careers if you are not a lifelong learner, if you don't know the metacognitive skills of learning, if you don't know the study skills, if you don't know how to attack a new domain, if you don't know how to pick a new skill, if you don't even have the softer domains and competencies of things like even humility, because without humility you can't learn.
Yeah, and that's so important because you brought up the difference between curiosity and lifelong learning, right? And it's kind of the difference between practice and deliberate practice, right? So people say practice makes perfect, but that's not true, right? Practice that is intentional, where you have an end goal and you're seeking feedback to improve, becomes deliberate practice that leads to perfection, right? So you will see that a lot of kids who spend time with, right, play Uno in their household and they'll just play it on loop. And you'll see that over the years, they haven't gotten better at it, but they still enjoy playing it. But there'll be that 1 or 2 kids in that group who figure out strategy and is now looking out and trying to be aware because for them, those kids, the outliers, their aim is not to play Uno. Their aim is to get better at Uno, right? And it's a huge difference. And when you look at the aspect of, I may be changing jobs multiple times and I may be even changing professions multiple times, right? I think the world has moved along from like, have you stuck to a career? Like, are you a finance guy from day one till the day you retire? Rather to, are you purpose driven? So if you've shifted jobs, if you've changed career paths, right? Are you still working towards that same big goal, like poverty alleviation or equitable access to education or just transforming the finance sector or anything like that, right? But defining that big goal. So even though your pathway changes, right, something allows you to transfer learnings from one job to another in a manner that becomes relevant.
So is this why probably people say think big or have a focus or have this one big goal? Do you think there could be some connections to this?
Oh, I think we have to alternate between thinking big and being focused on a small, narrow goal. But just to get a little philosophical right now, right?
Because after all, you're an engineer.
Oh, Oh, yeah. So there are times where you function as an individual, you function as Willie. These are my goals, my ambitions. And there are some times where you get lost in it and you become society, right? You don't think of yourself as an individual. Something just draws you and you start working. And that's when you become the cell in your body that becomes a smaller part of a much larger organism, right? But we keep alternating between the individual and the group.
Mm.
And both are required because individualism helps shape certain aspects of your identity. And then the group gives you the space to thrive in it, right? And make sure that you take everyone with you. Because unlike survival of the fittest, nature operates with the thought of survival of the rest, right? You try as hard as possible to maintain as diverse ecological system so that when everything survives, you survive,
Oh,
right? And in this way, right, your big goal, according to me, your big goal needs to be societal in nature, but this is just personal opinion. And your narrow goal needs to be about you. And of course, these are interchangeable depending on what stage of life you are in and things like that.
it's absolutely brilliant. One thing that comes to mind is with all the amount of experience and anyone listening to this conversation, it's already been 57 minutes. And you know that Jonathan has some incredible ideas and insights. What do you think um, you would want to tell a young person today who wants to enter education because they've heard so much about edtech, and things like that, and they would want to enter into education and they want to either do a startup or build something for creating change and impact. What are your quick inputs or suggestions? Something that we could share with them as a little reel.
Hmm. So I would build up on the initial part of our conversation and I would tell them one, be empathetic, right? Or sensitive. Like get down and do the groundwork or make sure that you're speaking to the people who are going to be the recipients of whatever product that you build. And finally, change the mindset from I'm going to scale to that context to build with people, right? Because if you build with your clients or your customers, and if you stop seeing them as customers in this early stage and you start seeing them as partners, you really end up building something that people value and that people will go out of their way to make sure survives because they respect it.
Hmm. And what do you think funders are looking for when it comes to giving out, let's say, CSR money for initiatives that are making social impact and change?
So I think it's too wide to comment on um, briefly, but if I have to organize the sector, I would say there's a scale from um, grassroots work to system change, and there's a whole spectrum in between, right? So, one, you need to know where you lie, and you need to find funders that support that level of thinking, right? So, there are some funders that want to only fund work that is being done directly with children, and there are some who want to fund system or policy level change. And again, there's the whole spectrum in between, right? But it becomes very important to be honest to yourself, right? What are you really trying to do? And to be honest with your funders, right? There is no obligation on either party's part, right? You don't have to work with the government. You work with the government if it's part of your plan, right? You don't work with the government because it'll get me funding or anything like that, right? Like it needs to be thought through and it needs to be something that you want to do, right? But being true to yourself becomes the number one aspect in all of this.
That's brilliant. So, what are you, like 50 years old?
Getting there.
Okay. How old are you today?
30.
And how, at the age of 30, did you manage to get this experience, start this company, this foundation called the Barefoot Edu Foundation, and work with so many people? What are some of the, some of your own habits, personal habits of success? What are some of the ways that you get more knowledge? And what are some of the ways that you are able to use that knowledge and make change happen?
So I think inherently, like all of us are barefoot are like super curious people, and that helps a lot. But one of the things I tell people when they start visiting a school, and people have all sorts of comments, right, like good and bad in their experience. But boredom seems to be something that that is spoken about a lot nowadays, right? People getting bored at work. And like I always tell them, if you're getting bored at work, then like consider changing your job, because you should be doing the best thing with your life that you think you can be doing. But if you're getting bored in a school, then you need to start paying attention, right? Because there's just so much happening over here. And I think that's one of the perks of being in the education sector. There's so much happening. Okay. All you have to do is be aware.
Are there any podcasts or books or authors or professors that you very ardently follow, and people involved in shaping your philosophy of education
Oh,
or theory of change?
oh, there's a ton. But interestingly, most of my like realizations in the education space have come either through experience or conversation with people. But the general overarching thinking, the first book that blew my mind, right, was written by Buckminster Fuller. It's called Operating Manual to Spaceship Earth.
Okay.
And it talks about Earth as the spaceship that's just like hurtling to space, and you have limited resources which act as a battery. And that's your time period to figure things out, right?
Wow.
But it really awoken the urgency in me, and a way of thinking about systems, which then led me to explore Donella Meadows, who is such a brilliant person, just fantastic when it comes to systems thinking. She's able to break things down into very, very tangible ways, right? Other podcasts, I would say just in anything that you watch, in anything that you experience, try to make a connection to your field, because some of the most transformative ideas don't come from your industry, right? It comes when you pair from one industry to another, kind of like what biomimicry does.
Mm.
Says, hey, we're stuck with a problem, let's look to nature,
Mm.
right? Oh, the kingfisher, you know,
Scoops down at 250 kilometers per hour right into the ground. So let's
Yeah.
name a aircraft after that.
let's emulate its shape, or let's emulate its beak, because when its beak pierces the water, it doesn't get a ripple.
Mm.
So if you make the nose of a bullet train in the same way, when it enters a tunnel, maybe you won't get an air ripple and you won't get a tunnel boom, and you have you have softer trains,
Wow.
right? But I think the most profound realizations come from other industries when applied to your own.
Have you thought of writing a book?
I am writing a book.
Oh,
Actually, editing to be more precise.
tell us a
but-
little bit more about this book. What is this book? What got you to write it? What have you written about, and how could people get a copy of that?
Oh, so it's called Building Democratic Schools and Learning Environments. And three of us, Dr. Linda, Nathan, Gustavo, and me, have been putting this together over the past year and a half. And it's 39 case studies of schools from around the world that have been able to set up a democratic learning environment for their children, either within school or through after school programs, or just have conceptualized some way of giving children more autonomy and helping them mobilize institutions for the greater good, to propagate an open flow of ideas without any kind of judgment taking place. But it's really fantastic to see what schools have been doing. But we try to follow a democratic process in assembling the book itself. So instead of us writing about it, we encouraged the principals and school owners to write about it and provided them the support required to articulate in a way that readers can have tangible takeaways. So the book's due in December, to be published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's open access. So it'll be available for free in the online version for anyone.
Brilliant. So the adage that the best things in life are free definitely hold true. Thank you so much, Jonathan Mendonca. It was such a brilliant 1 hour 15 minutes that we spent.
Thanks for having me here. Really enjoyed this, and your super professional setup.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the Will Talks podcast.